Jackson's presidency. This is a lesson read aloud for lesson 4.06. The Jackson era ushered in changes in the way the political parties organized and operated. As the Whigs and the Democrats defined and articulated the positions and goals, some elements of the modern party system emerged. Nullification was one issue that caused dissent and forced politicians to clarify their positions. Did a state have the right to nullify a federal law? Would a state's rights slavery owning president come down on the side of the Union and the federal government? And where would such a president stand on the matter of the Second National Bank and the renewal of its charter? For a man defined by his simplicity, Jackson's administration would be characterized by complexity. Goals for this lesson. Describe what is meant by the term Jacksonian democracy and the policies and practices associated with Jackson. Identify the major issues and philosophical differences that divided Whigs and Democrats during the 1830s and who supported each. Explain the concept of nullification and why it was a threat to the existence of the United States. Recognize major elements of the modern American political party system that emerged during the Jackson era. And then we will begin with our reading. Don't forget to get your reading guide and lesson answer key. And we will start by reading pages 289 through 299. Okay. Democrats versus Whigs. Jackson and his advisors built a strong and well-organized political party. The Democrats' political opponents came together under the banner of a new party called the Whig Party. They took their name from the Whigs of England, who were known as the historic enemies of royalty. The name was intended to ridicule what they saw as the heavy-handed tactics of King Andrew. The Whigs never had a single leader, but their two most prominent congressional champions were New England's Daniel Webster and Kentucky's Henry Clay. While Webster was known as the best orator in the United States, Clay, who had managed the Missouri Compromise, was regarded as the country's most skilled politician. Though damaged by the charges he had struck a corrupt bargain with Adams in 1824, he was revered by many in the West, and especially by those who shared his faith in the potential for national growth spurred by an energetic federal government. In general, Whigs tended to be people who stood to gain from the new market economy or people who hoped to gain from it. North and South, many merchants and bankers flocked to the Whig Party, as did farmers who specialized in one or two products and sought to sell their crops to a larger national or international market. At the same time, moral reformers, especially reform-minded Protestant clergymen, joined the Whigs, who tended to be more critical of slavery and more troubled by the treatment of Native Americans. By contrast, the Democratic Party attracted voters who were skeptical of the emerging market economy. Democrats including many small farmers and frontiersmen who distrusted banks. Many factory workers and city laborers were Democrats, including recent immigrants. Also siding with the Democrats were craftsmen who feared that the new mixed economy would undermine their role, strong supporters of slavery, and those who urged aggressive Western expansion of the nation's territory. The differences between Whigs and Democrats, especially on the role of the federal government in the life of the nation, created a dynamic political atmosphere in the age of Jackson. Those two parties continued to dominate the American politics until the eve of the Civil War. Internal improvements. Whigs generally supported higher protective tariffs, the creation of a national banking system, and federal funds for internal improvements such as roads, bridges, and canals. While Democrats also called for internal improvements, they thought that the states and local governments should fund them. By contrast, Whigs believed that the federal government should sponsor these projects. Henry Clay championed his American system and hoped that a federal program of internal improvements would build up the nation's manufacturing base to create a mixed economy, combining the best elements of farming and industry. When he campaigned for the presidency, Jackson had been purposely vague about his stance on funding internal improvements. But in 1830, he challenged his Whig opponents by vetoing the Maysville Road Bill. This bill would have provided federal funds to extend the national road, which ran between several states, from Maysville to Lexington to Kentucky. Arguing that this project was of purely local character because it did not cross state lines, Jackson angered many Whigs by limiting his administration's commitment to internal improvements. Although Jackson's administration eventually spent twice as much money on internal improvements as all previous administrations combined, the policy he laid down in the Maysville Road veto affirmed his conviction that that the larger burden for internal improvements should be borne by the states. All told, between the mid-1820s and the Civil War, state and local governments spent much more money on public work projects than the federal government did. In the debate over internal improvements, the issue was not whether roads, bridges, and canals were necessary. Both parties agreed on the need, but disagreed on the role of the federal government. Whigs looked to the federal government for funding and leadership. Jacksonian Democrats favored a limited federal government. They wanted state and local governments, which they believed to be more responsive to the will of the people, to be in charge. The tariff debate and the nullification crisis. Whigs and Democrats also sparred over the question of tariffs. Many Whigs, like Henry Clay, thought the federal government should impose high taxes on imported goods. Such high tariffs would make foreign goods more expensive and thus spur the development of American industries such as textiles. The revenues from tariffs would also help fund internal improvements, which most Whigs vigorously supported. By contrast, many Democrats favored lower tariffs. Southern planters wanted to keep tariffs low so that they could purchase cheaper manufactured goods from Europe. And they did not want high American tariffs to provoke European countries to tax imports of American cotton. Southern Democrats also reasoned that without revenue from custom duties, the federal government would remain weak, thus leaving decisions about internal improvements to states, while also limiting any possible federal interference with the growing institution of slavery. President Jackson, a Tennessee planter himself, was sympathetic to calls for lower tariffs, but he soon found himself facing a crisis over the issue. As he began his presidency, Jackson inherited a tariff that had been passed at the end of the Adams administration in 1828. It was called the Tariff of Abominations by critics, who rightly pointed to its hodgepodge of protections for various special interests. Jackson's own vice president, Southern Carolina John C. Calhoun, had drafted a set of resolutions for his state legislature called the South Carolina Exposition and Protest of 1828. Calhoun's resolutions not only condemned the tariff, but also asserted South Carolina's right to nullify such legislation, to declare it invalid and without legal force. Like Jefferson and Madison's earlier Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, Calhoun's resolution raised the issue of state versus federal powers. But Calhoun's resolution went further than earlier declarations by contending that a state could nullify federal legislation with which it did not agree and take action to prevent enforcement within its borders. Calhoun's resolutions also implied that a state could secede or separate from the Union if it deemed such a step necessary. Calhoun had once been a strong nationalist. He had even served as vice president under John Quincy Adams, though he had broken with Adams in the 1828 election. Re-elected as vice president, Calhoun found that his support for nullification placed him on a collision course with Andrew Jackson. Why did Calhoun switch from being a nationalist to a states' right advocate? The answer lies partly with politics and partly with conviction. Having been absent from his home state for many years, Calhoun returned to South Carolina and discovered that the slavery controversy in the recent Missouri Compromise had made many of his neighbors suspicious of a strong federal government. Calhoun, a strong supporter of slavery, began to fear, like his neighbors, that a strong federal government might interfere with the growth of slavery in the South. The issue came to a boil in 1830 when South Carolina Senator Robert Hayne gave a speech defending the ideas of Calhoun's South Carolina Exposition and Protest. Hayne contended that the states formed a compact and were simply a league that could choose which legislation to obey and could secede if necessary. Daniel Webster wandered onto the Senate floor during this speech and could not believe his ears. What began as a discussion about tariffs and nullification soon swelled into a general debate over states' rights and the nature of the Union. For 2 days, the Senate came to a standstill as Webster delivered a rousing speech refuting Hayne's arguments. The Senate chamber was a small room with the senators' desks arranged in several semicircular rows. Spittoons lined the aisle so that statesmen could chew tobacco while listening to the debate. With the galleries packed with onlookers, the air in the chamber grew thick and stifling. Very little distance separated the adversaries. Throughout the debate, Vice President John Calhoun passed notes to Hayne, who incorporated his colleagues' ideas into his remarks. Shaking his finger at Calhoun, Webster declared, "I go for the Constitution as it is, and the Union as it is. It is, sir, the people's Constitution, the people's government, made for the people, made by the people, and answerable to the people." The high point of his oratory came when Webster declared, "Liberty and Union, now and forever, one and inseparable." Jackson's response to nullification. Everyone wondered what stance President Jackson would take in this controversy. Though no fan of a strong national government, and certainly no admirer of Daniel Webster, Jackson was determined to draw the line at nullification. He privately confided that he would die in the last ditch before he would see the Union disunited. Several days later, the president seized an opportunity to emphasize his resistance to nullification. The occasion was a fancy dinner reception at the Indian Queen Hotel. With all the principals seated at the banquet table, Senator Hayne rose to offer a toast, "The Union of the States and the sovereignty of the States." Visibly irritated, President Jackson waited his turn. He then stood and, staring directly at Calhoun, offered a toast of his own. "Our federal union, it must be preserved." The president, despite his Southern heritage and leanings, stood firm as an uncompromising nationalist. Tensions worsened during the election campaign of 1832. Calhoun, removed from the Democratic ticket over a split with Jackson, urged South Carolina lawmakers to pass the Ordinance of Nullification, generally known as the Nullification Act. The act declared the federal tariffs of 1828 and 1832 illegal and asserted South Carolina's right, if necessary, to secede from the Union and organize a separate government. Jackson, exhausted after a grueling campaign, yet enraged by South Carolina's actions, fired back. He issued a proclamation to the people of South Carolina, both urging and threatening them to stop while there was still time. To show he meant business, he ordered a naval command to prepare for battle, sent federal troops to South Carolina, and rearmed 2 federal forts in Charleston Harbor. South Carolinians began to make military preparations to defend against any federal attempts to enforce the tariffs. South Carolina and the United States were on the brink of war. As soon as Congress reconvened after the Christmas recess in January 1833, they swiftly passed a force bill authorizing the use of military force against the rebellious state. To Martin Van Buren, who later became vice president, Jackson wrote, "The crisis must be now met with firmness, our citizens protected, and the doctrine of nullification and secession just put down forever. I expect soon to hear that a civil war has commenced." But civil war was avoided and the controversy over nullification temporarily settled when in 1833 Henry Clay, the great compromiser, crafted a deal. To please Southern Democrats, Jackson signed into law a bill that generally lowered the tariffs. While most Americans celebrated Jackson's strong stand for the Union, the debate was far from over. Less than a quarter of a century later, South Carolina would again take a stand for states' rights. And South Carolina would be the first state to secede from the Union during the Civil War. The Monster Bank and King Andrew's veto. Okay, let's start. Monster Bank and King Andrew's veto. Though the threat of nullification had passed, Whigs were still eager to prevent Jackson's re-election in 1832 and thought they knew how to do it. For years, Jackson, like many Democrats and frontiersmen, had criticized the Second Bank of the United States. Chartered by Congress after the War of 1812, the bank held federal deposits and largely controlled the nation's money supply. But the institution was run by private bankers. To Jackson, the bank, headed by Nicholas Biddle, a wealthy financier from a rich family, represented an elite, privileged institution. He thought it aided the wealthy and penalized ordinary folk by restricting credit. The bank's charter was due to expire in 1836. Okay, actually I'm going to stop here because we're almost out of time for this first recording and we'll pick up again at that paragraph.